As much as I love the original 2D Sonic games, to be honest, back when Sonic Mania was both announced and released, while I was excited for the game and I did enjoy it a lot, it didn't really blow me away, especially, and the primary reason for that is because years prior I had already played Freedom Planet. And Freedom Planet is kind of the exact thing that I've been wishing Sonic would do for a very long time. A true evolution of 2D Sonic gameplay, not just going back to the old games and doing it again, but actually looking at what those original 2D Sonic games were doing and asking the question, what can we do to make this better? Because as you can see watching the gameplay, Freedom Planet is a Sonic game. Sonic-like, whatever you want to call it, is pretty blatant about it. In fact, when this game began development, it was originally going to be a Sonic fan game, but they instead decided to turn it into its own original thing. So obviously, it's very upfront about its influences. It's not trying to hide it or anything. But Freedom Planet is one of those indie game cases where a developer tries to bring back the kind of game that they loved when they were younger, but they kind of end up surpassing the thing that they were inspired by. Which I know sounds like a very bold claim, saying that I think Freedom Planet is better than the 2D Sonic games, but there's honestly a lot of changes here to the Sonic formula that I think are fantastic, and I would love to see the Sonic games do a lot of these exact things. As a simple, small example, if you look at the character of Mila, she's kind of your Tails equivalent in this game. She can fly similarly to Tails. But when you look at the 2D Sonic games, Tails' flight kind of works stupid. You have to mash the button for no reason to ascend, and you can't stop flying. Once you start flying, you're stuck that way, which can be very annoying. And Freedom Planet just says, well, let's not do that, and they have a much better flight system here, where you simply hold the jump button to ascend and let go to stop flying. Elegant, simple, straightforward, and quite frankly, better. And you look at things as recent as Sonic Superstars, and they still continue to do Tails' flight in the exact same way it was done in Sonic 3, for no reason more than that's how it was done before, so let's just keep doing it that way. And that's what I love about Freedom Planet. It is a 2D Sonic game heavily inspired by the original Mega Drive games, but it's not stuck in the past. It is not unwilling to do new things and acknowledge that the original Sonic games had problems and flaws and can be made better. And that's just a very small example of one thing Freedom Planet does to improve on the Sonic games, but there's tons of stuff like that all over. One of the biggest differences between Freedom Planet and Sonic is that this game doesn't have any equivalent to the ring system. It just has a traditional health bar. You just take damage, and when you run out of health, you die. And I think that's something that if you suggested Sonic adopt a system like that, people would say, what, are you crazy? That's so generic and boring. Every game does that. The ring system is something so unique to Sonic. We gotta keep that. But then you play Freedom Planet, and you're like, oh, but this is better. And it's better for a multitude of reasons. First of all is the exploitable nature of the ring system in the Sonic games. You can basically take infinite hits. It's very hard to die from anything that doesn't insta-kill you in the Sonic games. Whereas Freedom Planet, if you're playing on the default difficulty, while you do have health, you have a lot of health in this game, and most things don't really do that much damage, which means you can still kind of take a lot of hits and play fairly carelessly and get through the game. But, unlike Sonic, you can't do that forever. If you take too many hits, then it will add up and you will eventually die. It does create a little bit more demand for the player to play proficiently than the Sonic games do, where you can really just damage boost your way through everything. And while in Freedom Planet, it can feel like you can do the same thing at first, as you get further in the game and it gets more difficult, they start throwing a lot of hazards and enemies at you, and you'll find yourself dying really quickly if you continue to play carelessly. So you end up with a health system that works similarly in function to what the ring system is supposed to do for Sonic, in that it makes the game very forgiving. You can take a lot of hits, but it's not overly forgiving to the point where you don't even really have to try anymore. Plus Freedom Planet, rather than having rings everywhere that can heal you if you're down to 0, it has these little health capsules that are around the place, kind of like item monitors, but that means you gotta search for them. You gotta go off the beaten path, gotta do a bit of exploring, it motivates the player to search around the level and see what they can find. It also makes shields a lot more valuable because they can protect you from a couple of hits in this game, and in a game where it's much more realistic that you're going to die from taking too many hits, that matters a whole lot more. And while we're talking about taking damage, two other really big differences in Freedom Planet compared to Sonic is that, one, there's no contact damage in this game. If you run into an enemy, nothing happens. The only thing that damages you are actual attacks and hazards. And two, when you take a hit, it doesn't do that Sonic thing where it explodes you back and you lose control for a bit until you hit the ground. You just get a brief hit stun animation, and then you're right back to doing what you were doing. And these choices help maintain the flow of Freedom Planet so well. In the Sonic games, when you take a hit, it feels so incredibly awful. Not just because you took damage, not just because you lost your rings, but because the game completely stops you from whatever you were trying to do and says, nah, motherfucker, you suck, now eat it. And that can sometimes lead to, like, getting knocked into lower routes, completely destroying your run, or sometimes even knocking you into bottomless pits. And it feels very brutal, honestly. Whereas in Freedom Planet, when you get hit, it feels more like the game is just saying, you made a mistake. Whenever you take a hit, made a mistake there, made another mistake. It still does punish you, it still interrupts you with that brief pause and slows you down a little bit, but it doesn't feel like the game is trying to destroy your entire universe anytime you screw up. And I feel that encourages players to play a little riskier, a little looser, and a little faster. If you watch lesser experienced players play Sonic games, especially the originals when they're in 4x3 and you have less visibility, you see a lot of players end up tiptoeing their way through the game because they're afraid of running into something that's going to damage them just because it feels so bad. And that's kind of the antithesis of what these games are trying to get. We want to encourage players to go fast, not slow down. And of course the idea there is you need to get good enough that you can go fast. But if a first-time player's initial experience, it feels like they don't want to do that, then they're not necessarily going to be incentivized to go back and try again and try to get better. Freedom Planet, right off the bat, feels much more welcoming to players trying to go fast because if they make mistakes, it's not going to be as big of a deal. And that plays in well to the fact that there's no contact damage in this game because as you get further, as I said, they start throwing way more enemies and hazards at you, and it starts to turn into this, like, crazy survival game because you have so many hit points you can take, and because you're only taking damage from actual dedicated enemy attacks, they can pack these levels with way more threats than you ever find in any 2D Sonic game. The last couple levels in this game, they're kinda crazy when you look at it, the amount of shit that they are throwing at you that you need to avoid. It's almost unreasonable feeling in a way, but it doesn't feel too bad because you can still take a lot of damage. But again, you can only take so much. You do need to avoid a decent amount of these things. It keeps you on your toes. You're constantly looking out for the next thing that's going to hit you, because if you screw up too many times, it's going to whittle away at you and kill you. This design of smaller, more frequent, less punishing mistakes that add up, I think, is a great approach to a Sonic-type game, rather than the way most Sonic games do it, where it feels very all or nothing. You're either playing really well and going really fast, or you're playing poorly and you keep on getting interrupted and it kind of just feels bad. These are the kinds of design decisions that make me love this game. I haven't talked about, like, the overall game itself too much yet, but it's super fun, really great gameplay and level design. If you're a fan of the 2D Sonic games, it's an absolute must-play. But on top of all the great things that come from the Sonic games, Freedom Planet also fixes almost all of the bad and problematic things about the Sonic games. A really interesting one is how they handle slopes in Freedom Planet, because you know that Sonic thing that sometimes new players struggle with, where you gotta run up a slope, but then they don't have enough speed and they fall down, and sometimes players struggle to figure that out, so they gotta add the spin dash, or even dash panels in later games to try to alleviate those problems. Freedom Planet has a very interesting Sonic 4-esque solution to that problem. They just say screw it, you can just walk up walls at whatever speed you want, it doesn't matter. And that seems like, what the heck are you doing? That's like bad Sonic physics stuff, don't do that. But then you play it and you know what? It's totally fine and it works and it helps keep the flow going. And you still feel bad for doing it because you're slowly walking up the wall, but it just lets you keep on going. It doesn't interrupt the pacing in the way that if you fell down the wall and had to spin dash back up, it would. But I think the main thing I love about Freedom Planet that I wish the Sonic games would do is in how it expands on the movesets and how the characters play differently from each other. You got 3 playable characters in Freedom Planet, Lilac, Carol, and Mila, and they are very much stand-ins for Sonic, Knuckles, and Tails. But unlike the Sonic games with their one-button gameplay where every character plays identically except for one move they have distinct from each other, the Freedom Planet characters play very differently from each other. They still have the same core physics-based platforming, but their movesets are radically different and allow them to approach these levels in totally different ways. Not only do the characters have different moves from each other, they have entirely different mechanics. Like the meter in the top left of the screen, Lilac uses it a lot, and it's quite interesting because the gems, which are like this game's stand-in for coins or rings or whatever, not only do they give you extra lives, but they also fill the meter, so you can incorporate that into your routing through the level to fill the meter more quickly so you can use it more often. Meanwhile, Carol has this really cool upgraded state that she can enter with her motorcycle that gives her really powerful movement abilities, and Mila doesn't use the meter at all. She has a totally different system that is tuned specifically for her unique abilities. It is really awesome stuff, but I'm not going to talk about it here. I'm going to save talking about the character movesets for Freedom Planet 2, because that game just expands on what these characters can do and makes them even cooler. But suffice it to say, I think that all the characters in Freedom Planet are extremely fun to play, and in ways kind of put their Sonic counterparts to shame in terms of the kind of gameplay experience they offer with those kinds of abilities. And the Freedom Planet does Sonic things better than Sonic Train refuses to end, because by far the biggest thing this game has over Sonic is the boss fights and the combat. Because bosses in the Sonic games, as I have stated numerous times throughout many of my videos, are pretty terrible almost universally. Whereas Freedom Planet, the boss fights in this game are great. They're really good. And the difference here is that whereas Sonic is a speed-based physics platformer that they shove bosses into, in Freedom Planet they said, hey, what if we actually put in a combat system so that way the bosses have something to actually work with? This is where a lot of the health and damage changes also work out really well, because it allows you to just have more of a straight-up drag-out fight with the bosses here. And you kind of have almost like Smash Bros-esque movesets. You got an attack button, and you can press different directions with attack to make your character do different moves. And what's smart about the movesets here is that almost every ability all the characters have double as both a movement option and a combat tool. Lilac's Dragon Boost is her equivalent of the Spin Dash in this game. You can shoot yourself off with a lot of speed with it, but then for combat applications, it has invincibility on it, so you can use it to go through boss attacks and hit them when you normally wouldn't be able to, and it just does a shit ton of damage in general, so it's really useful, but again, it works on that meter, so you can't use it too much. Her dive kick move, really good for launching yourself down, helps you build up a lot of speed if you land it on downward slopes. But also against enemies, it hits a lot of times really quickly, so you can get in a lot of damage if you use it right. And so on and so forth. Almost everything in Freedom Planet is useful in both platforming and combat, and it's so great to see this kind of thing, because I've always said with combat in the Sonic games that it's just so bad. Can we just not have bosses, please? But Freedom Planet has a different solution to the problem. It says, well, if we're gonna have bosses, then how about we make them good? And again, because we have an actual health system here, you can't just damage boost your way through because you will die, especially to the later bosses. And it's pretty weird. I'm so used to fast-paced action platformers like this, dreading boss fights, and Freedom Planet has a lot of bosses, yet I don't have any problem with them. When they show up, I'm not like, oh god, here's another boss. I'm as happy to fight them as I am to rush through the levels. And while we're talking about this, I do want to mention one thing that I also appreciate about Freedom Planet. As much as it obviously does take a lot of influence from Sonic, that's not the only thing that Freedom Planet is inspired by. It's kind of like the Shovel Knight of the Mega Drive, where it pulls from a lot of Mega Drive classics, especially Treasure games, who, if you're not familiar, they're responsible for games like Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier and Dynamite Headdy. And the developers of Freedom Planet themselves have described this game as what if Treasure made a Sonic game, and that's very apt, because like this combat and the way it feels, it's very Treasure-like in how everything works. The complexity and the depth of the movesets and stuff here, very similar to their games. And there's also a lot of just straight-up blatant references to Treasure games, especially this one boss here that is clearly supposed to be Seven Force from Gunstar Heroes, which is a very cool little reference. As someone that adores both Sonic and Treasure games, the combination of the two of them here works so incredibly well for me. I friggin' love it. And as I'm sure you can tell by the tone of the video so far, I love just about everything about Freedom Planet. It goes without saying, the visuals and music here are also spectacular. I love the pixel art, but you know, it's not a perfect game. I do have some criticisms for it. This video is not just why Freedom Planet is better than Sonic. It's just mostly that, but to air some of my grievances with Freedom Planet, one thing that is arguable whether or not it's really a problem or of a preference thing, and honestly I don't have a huge issue with it. You might be surprised to find, if you haven't played Freedom Planet, that these games are actually really story-heavy. You'd think that a game like this would be very arcadey, just focused on action and gameplay, but there are a lot of cutscenes in these games, arguably too many, and they go on for quite a long time. If you're doing a playthrough in the story mode, more than half of your playtime could end up being watching cutscenes here. And the story and writing in Freedom Planet, it's not, like, awful, but it's certainly not anything to write home about. It's fairly amateurish in a number of ways. Not the most compelling plot, not the best writing, certainly not the best voice acting you've ever heard. But honestly, I don't really have that much of a problem with that, because the storytelling of Freedom Planet, while it's not great, you can really tell that they were trying their darndest to make something good here. This isn't a thing where they were just like, whatever, it's an action platformer, story's not really that big of a deal. They were really trying, and while it's not the best thing in the world, that passion and that love really does come through. Like, I find the characters charming enough, and they did a lot of world building here to try to make something cool. And, you know, I appreciate the effort. I find it amusing enough that I watched through the cutscenes my first time playing Freedom Planet, and I had a pleasant enough time with it, but it's not really something that I'm ever gonna revisit, I don't think. The major issue for me is just that there is so much story, and it really can get in the way of the pacing here if you really just want to focus on the gameplay. There is an arcade mode in the game that completely eliminates all story, so if you just want to play the game, you can do that, and that's cool. But it is a little unfortunate that the story is a little overly long-winded and kinda harms the overall game experience. And that applies to Freedom Planet 2 as well. I find that game is a little bit better with it, but still kind of the same issue. Another problem I have with Freedom Planet, this one is not the most egregious thing in the world, but it is certainly a problem. The game is occasionally straight up unfair, actually. There are certain, like, boss attacks that have no telegraphing. They just come out instantly and hit you, which is not cool. Sometimes there are some enemy patterns that they throw at you where there are really no options of how to deal with it without taking a bunch of damage. And a couple of things like that that crop up here and there. Nothing that's, like, game-ruining per se, but just some annoyances that crop up where it's like, what was I supposed to do about that? Come on, man. But by far, my biggest problem with Freedom Planet that could have honestly harmed my enjoyment of this game substantially if circumstances were different, the levels here are way too long. A lot of Freedom Planet levels can be somewhere in the ballpark of like 12, 13 minutes sometimes, especially on your first playthrough. They can be even longer. And long levels in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, but if you watch my Sonic videos, you know my favorite thing to do in Sonic games is to time attack them, to play the levels over and over, learn them, master them, really try to optimize and get as fast as I can. I find that to be incredibly fun in these kinds of games. But I actually don't like to time attack Freedom Planet because these levels are so long. Because with a time attack experience, you want to try to refine your run as much as possible and get that perfect clean run where you nail everything. But the longer the level is, the longer that takes to do. Not just because you have more to learn and practice, but because if you're having a good run on a 15-minute long level, and then you screw up at 14 minutes and 30 seconds, then you have to redo the entire thing, performing well that whole time just to get another crack at that one thing you screwed up at the end. And when this game is as complex with its moveset as it is, there's a lot of ways you can screw up that would kill your time. So you end up having to do these really long levels many, many, many times, and it's just way too much of a time sink, honestly. As I've said multiple times, I'm not a speedrunner. I'm not gonna sit here and practice a 2-hour full game run for 1,000 hours. I just am not into that. I like the snappy fun of mastering a level, but if it's too much of a commitment, then it's just a drag, man. And it's quite weird because a lot of the levels in Freedom Planet feel like they're supposed to follow like Sonic Zone structure, where you'll have the first half of the level and then a boss fight at the end of it, and it feels like that could be the end of the level, but then you just keep going, and the level will like change environment and have new music, and it feels like I've started Act 2, but it's just one giant level. If they just split these levels at these points, then I think all of this would be totally alleviated. These levels would be much more approachable in that way, and I think it would have been great. I don't really know why they decided to have the levels be so gigantic, and Freedom Planet 2 does the same thing, but it means that I don't actually time attack these games, which would be a big problem for me, but honestly, I don't even care. Freedom Planet is just so much fun to play that even a more casual, just like play through the game beginning to end, I have such a great time with that I still love it regardless. You know, I've done many playthroughs of the games at this point that I do try to improve my runs and stuff and do it as fast as I can, but I'm not like dedicated loading up a level and playing it for an hour to try to get as good as I can. I just play the game and try to go fast, and I have a ton of fun with it. So even though Freedom Planet misses the mark on my favorite aspect of Sonic games, it does very little to harm the experience for me. Would I prefer if these games were more time attack friendly? Absolutely. But I'm not really that broken up over the fact that they're not, especially because level design-wise, they're not exactly as geared toward like speedrunning as Sonic games are. They do kinda sometimes do the multi-tiered design, but a lot of times they're doing like different things with the level design here that feels like it's more of just a general platformer, and it works really well in that way, so it's fine. And that's Freedom Planet. It's great, can't recommend it enough. But honestly, as great as Freedom Planet is, it is nothing compared to Freedom Planet 2. Freedom Planet 1, I think, is a fantastic Sonic-like game that improves on the Sonic formula in many great ways. Freedom Planet 2 is one of my favorite 2D platformers I've ever played, possibly my #1 favorite. This game continues to evolve 2D Sonic gameplay and bring it up to that next level. That means a lot to me because what I've always wanted to see is the core original 2D Sonic formula pushed as far as it can possibly be. And honestly, I think Freedom Planet 2 is precisely that. I don't really think there's much more that you can do with these games and this gameplay. This game just does everything. First of all, this game does basically everything the first game was doing, so you got an incredibly solid foundation to build off of, but then they add so much on top of that. The biggest new addition to Freedom Planet 2 that I cannot praise highly enough is, holy shit, the camera zooms out. Oh my god, as someone that has spent the last 3 goddamn years of my life playing Sonic games ad nauseum, I cannot tell you how sick I have gotten of not being able to see in these games. And I know they want to encourage memorization or whatever, but it's so freaking annoying. You move way too fast in these games to react to what's coming up with how close the camera is in so many of them, including Freedom Planet 1. And Freedom Planet 2, much like many of the problems of the Sonic formula, they just say, okay, well, let's fix that. And so when you start going fast enough, the camera zooms out. You can actually customize it for how much you want the camera to zoom in. You can make it so it doesn't do it at all, and you might want to do that. I could see some people not loving this because it does mess up the sprite work in the game because of the scaling system here, and it does kind of look a bit ugly, honestly. But I'll take it, man, because it's so practical and makes the game play so much better. I mean, there is an argument to be made that not being able to see is part of the gameplay of Sonic, but I've come to realize that it's a very annoying part of the gameplay of Sonic that I don't know if I really like that much. And also, it's not just about being able to react to things better with the camera this zoomed out, It also makes it so you can make a lot more informed decisions about how you want to navigate the stage because you have way more of a frame of reference of what is around you. Like so many times in Sonic games, I am making blind jumps hoping that there's going to be a platform as I launch myself off of a slope. But here, I don't have to do that. I can see what's around me. I can intentionally jump toward the platforms and maneuver in ways where I know what's going to happen. It's amazing. It's glorious, it's beautiful, and honestly, I'm gonna have a very, very difficult time going back to any 2D Sonic game where the camera doesn't do this. If it was up to me, I think the camera in any 2D game like this should just be this zoomed out by default, because it's just simply better. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, why haven't the Sonic games themselves figured this out? I don't know, because they don't want their games to be too good or something? But obviously this game is not one of my favorite 2D platformers just because of its camera. The real reason I love Freedom Planet 2 is the same reason I love Freedom Planet 1, the characters and their movesets. This game has some of the most fun movement of any 2D platformer I've ever played, and once again, the characters are incredibly diverse here, even more so than they were in the first game, and I gotta talk about these character movesets. Starting with Lilac. Of course, with all the characters, you got the Sonic physics stuff, slope jumping, and going downhill, increasing your speed, all that good stuff. But Lilac being your Sonic-like character, I mentioned her Dragon Boost in the first game, and yeah, it's kind of like her Spin Dash, works off of the meter so you can't spam it, and you can use it in the air and do it at angles, and you can bounce off of things, but added in the second game is the ability to cancel the Dragon Boost, because in the first game, sometimes you could bounce off more than you wanted to and end up going in an unexpected direction, so that problem is solved here. But of course, Freedom Planet, everything that's useful for platforming is also useful for combat. Canceling the Dragon Boost leaves this lasting spark that does a ton of damage if enemies are on top of that, so when you're fighting bosses, Dragon Boost into them, get a bunch of hits right before it ends, cancel it, leave that doing more damage onto the boss. It's so cool. Lilac also has her Cyclone move she can do, which is basically a hover, gives you some extra distance on your jumps, but also cool thing about it, if you're going upward, then it increases how much you ascend. So if you, for example, hit a spring or go off a ramp and then immediately Cyclone, boom, you just go launching. I also mentioned Lilac's dive kick that she had in the first game. She has that here, but she also had this upward attack she could do. Now in Freedom Planet 2, you can also do it in the air, functioning a bit like a double jump, and you can combine the upward and downward attacks, plus you then work in some Dragon Boosts, and you find you can do like these cool combos that do so much damage to bosses. And they've also added a new universal mechanic to all the characters in this game. There's an invincible dodge now. Hells yeah, dude. But even cooler than that, all the characters, their invincible dodge has an additional secondary property attached to it. So Lilac's, for example, if you press dodge again shortly after doing one, then she does this little dash, which gives you a nice little burst of speed. Even if you're moving at maximum speed, it kind of just teleports you forward a short distance, allowing you to go faster with Lilac than any other character. But also, again, everything is double use. This dash also does damage, and you can do it after canceling a Dragon Boost, so that just throws on to the end of your combo, and you see what I'm talking about? This shit is so awesome. And then with Carol, she's your Knuckles equivalent type character, though instead of climbing walls, she just has a straight up wall jump, and I like this more than climbing, because it's more active, it's faster, and I'm actually doing something. I'm not just holding up, I'm manually doing all of the jumps individually. And Carol, combat-wise, is very melee-oriented. She has a lot of attacks of just, like, swiping with her claws. Like, she has this air dash she can do that doesn't really give her very much distance, but after it, you can attack, and she gets this big claw swipe that does a lot of damage. But some of my favorite moves with Carol are her aerial attacks. Her upward aerial attack is kind of like Lilac's. It gives you a little bit of extra height, but it also gives you a little more forward speed. So it's more usable when you're like rushing forward and you make a jump and you're just shy of hitting the platform. You just get that extra little boost and keep on going really fast. But her down air attack is the real shit because this thing launches Carol straight forward. And the cool thing about this, and a lot of the moves in Freedom Planet, is that they're additive. They are not like setting your speed value to a specific thing, which means you can quickly spam this move to build up a lot of speed really quickly. Takes a little bit of practice to get the rhythm down, but once you have it, down kick, down kick, down kick, and you're just zooming. Reminds me a lot of the air dash from Sonic Advance 1, and it's super fun. And we haven't even gotten to Carol's coolest moves yet, because in 2, they gave her this little jump disc, I think it's called, where you can throw it in 8 directions, and it'll hover there in place a little bit, and it kind of homes in on enemies if you're close enough. And it does damage over time, but then you can hit the button again, and Carol will fly toward the disc. And what's really cool about this is the angle she flies at the disc is based on where it is, so you can like throw it up and then move adjacent to its position to launch yourself like diagonally in a very specific direction. So you get a lot of really cool air control when playing as Carol. But of course, it also has combat applications. When you're doing that launch to the enemy, you're invincible and it does a ton of damage and sets you up to do that big claw swipe. And when you're platforming around, you can combine this with all her other stuff and the wall jumping to go all over the place in cool ways. And then there's also her motorcycle. We haven't even gotten to like her main core gimmick as a character. Around the levels, you can find these little gas cans that give Carol her motorcycle, which puts her into this like super powerful state where you go incredibly fast. And forget about wall climbing or wall jumping or anything. You can just stand on walls and run up and down them freely. And with the motorcycle, when you're so fast, you just go absolutely nuts. And when you're on the motorcycle, the dodge gives you a little burst of speed, so you can go even faster, and you get a double jump when you're using this thing. So you just become an unstoppable monstrosity when you're riding this thing. It's so awesome. Oh yeah, and by the way, when you're on the motorcycle, you can throw that thing around and then launch yourself to that. It's like, dude, how can you possibly come up with this many incredibly awesome things for your characters to do? I freaking love it. Then we have Mila, the least changed character from Freedom Planet 1, but she was honestly the character that needed changes the least because she was the most powerful and kinda had the coolest stuff going on. Like I said before, she's like your Tails equivalent, so she can fly, but that's really not even what's cool about Mila. What's cool about Mila is her cubes and her shield abilities. Mila doesn't really have much in the way of melee attacks. She's mostly focused on range, and she has a lot of really unique stuff that she can do. Dodging grants her this little cube thing that you can then shoot out, basically have like a gun when you're playing as her, and you got ammo, and you can dodge to reload. And she also has a shield she can pull up, which obviously protects her from many attacks, but also reflects projectiles back at enemies, which is incredibly useful. But the coolest thing Mila can do is with her cubes, rather than shooting out a bunch of small shots, you can shoot one really big shot out at once that obviously does a lot of damage towards enemies. But the real thing with this is it launches Mila backwards in the opposite direction, and like everything in Freedom Planet, this launch is additive, so if you already have a bunch of speed, say from jumping, and then you shoot downward, you can basically rocket jump with her. Mila has total air supremacy. Between her ability to launch herself around and her flight, you can go wherever the hell you want with her, and it's so much goddamn fun. Plus, then you're talking about, like, shooting upward to launch yourself down into downward slopes, and, like, you get the picture. It's super fucking cool. Which is then unfortunate when we get to the new character for Freedom Planet 2, Nira, who I don't like really at all, honestly. I think they really dropped the ball on this character, because Nira is by far the weakest character of anyone in both platforming and combat, and that's not necessarily a problem. You can have a weaker character that, you know, she can't cheese the level design as much, and she has a harder time fighting enemies, so she can function like a hard mode. But really, her whole moveset just doesn't really come together for me in a way that I find very fun. Like, her air ability is she just has a double jump. Not very interesting, and other characters already practically had double jumps. And she's mostly like a combat-oriented character. A lot of her moves are focused on attacks, but they're not like super useful or very damaging compared to like the attacks the other characters can do. And a lot of them don't really have practical platforming applications. She has this one thing she can do that's kind of cool, where her forward stab move kind of cancels her falling, so you can basically glide with it by doing it repeatedly through the air, and it's also just a good way to build speed with her. That's nice, but it doesn't really grant her any, like, unique ways to navigate the levels that other characters can't do. And then, like, her core gimmick is when you dodge with her, she enters this enhanced state where she's faster and she attacks faster, which, again, kind of cool, but not super useful. And then while you're in this state, or just in general, you can do these, like, special attacks where she has, like, enhanced versions of her moves that are kind of neat on paper, but ultimately don't work. Like, you can shoot this projectile that freezes enemies, and then you can use them as platforms. Sounds cool, not super useful. She has this, like, upward attack where it makes a cyclone and it pulls her up a little bit, but not very much. You can set up these ice pillars that reflect projectiles and you can jump off of them, and that's cool, but again, it doesn't give you, like, a ton of height. You can combine this with her upward cyclone move, but they both use the meter, so you have to, like, put out the pillars and then wait for it to refill, so you can't, like, use this stuff in tandem in, like, a good flow. I really just couldn't see, like, what the vision of Nira's gameplay is supposed to be. Maybe I was just having trouble figuring it out. Maybe I should look at, like, a Nira speedrun or something. Maybe she's got cool stuff going on, but from my time playing, I really just didn't like her, honestly. But whatever. The other 3 characters are insanely fun to play, and I'll happily play this game any day of the week as any of them. And another thing I want to mention about Freedom Planet 2 that I found was pretty interesting is that this game got a lot more experimental with its level design. It has a lot of, you know, traditional feeling Sonic-y type levels, but then it also has some levels where it kind of throws the traditional playbook out the window and does something kind of weird. Like, it'll have this one level where you have to find 4 keys to open this big door, and you go into these different areas, and it's like a little bit puzzly, and each one has like a different core mechanic that it's built around. Feels almost like a Zelda dungeon or something, and it's pretty cool. You have this whole one chapter of the game where it doesn't even really take place in traditional levels. You use the game's like arena mode that they've added, and you do a bunch of like weird challenges where you're like fighting groups of enemies, and then you actually fight against the other characters and their movesets, which is kind of cool. As someone that's not too keen on time attacking the Freedom Planet games, this kind of variety and this shying away from just like that core speed-oriented platforming, I think it actually works really well. I also think the combat here is overall a lot better than the first game, and there's a lot more of it too. Way more bosses. So many bosses in this game, actually. It's pretty awesome, and I got no problems with it because the combat's even better here. Though I will point out, it does feel quite different because of that invincible dodge now. Because in the first Freedom Planet, you had a little bit of invincibility you could do with certain characters to, like, counterattack enemies, but it worked on meters, so it wasn't something you could rely on wholly. Most of the time, you had to avoid the enemy attacks by actually getting out of the way of them. Here, now that you can dodge freely, it kind of feels a little bit more like, you know, general action games where it's just iframing through all the attacks. And it's less about, like, learning the enemy attacks and, like, how they work and where they're gonna attack, and just learning the timing of it and just parrying at the right time, you know? I mean, there are a lot of attacks that you can't parry because they, like, linger for too long or whatever, so you do have to dodge them, but it does make the combat feel a lot simpler as far as dodging stuff goes. But I think that's fine because the act of attacking the enemies is so much more interesting and fun here because of the much more expanded movesets. Oh yeah, the occasional moments of unfairness that I found in the first Freedom Planet, totally fixed here, no problems with that. Also, something worth pointing out is that Freedom Planet 2 kind of tries to shy away from, like, the arcadey nature of these kinds of games and go more in, like, an adventure direction. You have these hub worlds that remind me a lot of the hubs from Sonic Unleashed, where there's no gameplay here, you just walk around and talk to people, and it just adds, like, atmosphere and world building. Again, they put a lot of work into, like, the world and characters and lore and stuff in Freedom Planet. And, you know, it's nice. It doesn't add anything gameplay-wise, but I don't think it really messes with the pacing too much, and you get a lot of charming dialogue and characters and stuff, and the sprite art in this game is just gorgeous. They went for much higher resolution in this game, and I think it looks amazing. They've also added a shop where you can buy items that can either make the game easier or harder for you if you want, and that plays into the ranking system in a cool way. Honestly, I think the system is a bit over-designed, but whatever. This is also a really shockingly meaty game. It took me like around 4 hours per character to do a full playthrough, which is pretty nuts for a game like this. There is legitimately a lot of content here. Honestly, I could see some people thinking that maybe the game goes on a bit too long, but personally, I'm like, whatever. It just means I got more awesome game to play. I'm trying to look for criticisms here. The optional battle arena missions aren't super fun. I'm not in love with that part of the game, and it is mandatory for getting the true ending, so that's kind of blah. The final boss and end sequence was honestly a bit disappointing to me. I felt like we were going towards Gurren Lagann big, crazy, epic finale, and they didn't really do that. That was a bit of a shame. And story-wise in general, something I definitely have to say on this game. Obviously, Freedom Planet is not shy about how influenced it is by Sonic, but my god, this game's story, they really liked Sonic Adventure 2, that's all I'm gonna say. Oh yeah, that actually reminds me of one thing that I would criticize about this game. Both the Freedom Planet games kind of do like the Sonic Adventure, like, pick a character, play through the story as them, and you get a slightly different experience and slightly altered narrative depending on who you play as. And in the first game, they had unique levels for the characters that were, like, built around their movesets, and that was pretty cool. They don't have that in Freedom Planet 2, but that's not really my problem. My problem here is that I don't really feel that the different character stories is a valuable thing for the game. The majority of the story, no matter who you play as, plays out exactly the same way. So it doesn't really add anything to have the unique character stories here. I feel like it's just a holdover from, like, stuff they like from the Sonic games that they want to keep. But generally, I feel like this game would probably work better if you just played through the story and you could just change characters whenever you wanted between levels. You wouldn't have to alter the story beats very much to make that happen. You could even, like, maybe make some stuff, like, on your first story playthrough, you have to do this level as Carol or that level as Lilac, and that might actually be kind of cool. But yeah, it's not really like a major criticism or anything. I have no major criticisms for Freedom Planet 2. I friggin' love this game. I think it's awesome. I've mentioned this before, but the reason I love Sonic games so much really doesn't have anything especially to do with like Sonic or the physics-based gameplay or whatever. I just love 2D action platformers that are like fast-paced and awesome and let you do lots of cool shit. And the physics system of the Sonic games is something that lets you do that, and it's great. But I also really love 2D platformers that have like really complex movesets, and that's how it achieves its like interesting gameplay, like a Rayman Origins or something like that. And with Freedom Planet 2, you get the best of both worlds. You get all the cool Sonic physics on top of having really cool, unique, interesting character movesets through these fantastic levels, and also a good combat system and lots of awesome bosses, and, you know, a story that's amusing enough to go through the first time, and it adds some weight to what's going on beyond it's a video game. It's a beautiful game, amazing music, I really like the characters, I really like the character designs. I really like the, like, girl power vibe of Freedom Planet. You know, it's kind of like an inversion of what they do with Sonic, how the main trio's kind of a sausage fest with Sonic, Tails, Knuckles. So they say, alright, all our main player characters are going to be female in these games. And they don't do, like, the annoying shit that you see in a lot of modern stuff where they're like, look, we have women doing things, give us a medal for that. They're just awesome characters, and I love them. Like, undeniably, one of the biggest appeals of Sonic is Sonic himself and, like, the characters in the world. And because of that, I'm sure for many people, the fact that this isn't actually Sonic means they're not really that interested. But personally, I feel that Freedom Planet is quite strong in that department. Like, I genuinely do like these characters, and I want to go on more adventures with them. I hope we see more Freedom Planet games one day.
Hey, can you all hear me through this thing? Or funny, good buddy.
These games don't just get, like, the Sonic gameplay right for me, they also get the vibes right. It's not quite the same, they're doing their own thing, but I really dig it, and for so long I have lamented that the Sonic games have been so stuck in their ways, and they won't evolve and won't get to the kind of level that I know they can and I know would be awesome. But now after playing Freedom Planet 2, I'm like, actually, I think I'm okay with that. I don't need Sonic to do that, because Freedom Planet already has, and it's awesome. Of course, I would love if 2D Sonic could hit these kinds of heights, but if it never does, I think I'm okay with that. I got my fill. Freedom Planet has given me everything I could ever ask for, and I was serious when I said earlier that Freedom Planet feels like it's pushed it to the end point, because I don't know what more you could add to, like, a Freedom Planet 3 that wouldn't just feel, like, superfluous or making it overly complicated. There's already so much here, like, what more do you do? And in my opinion, that is a fantastic position for a game to be in.